Growing up, my family has pretty much always been a family that listens to Sirius XM in the car. And the channel that we would listen to pretty much all the time was channel 37, better known as Octane. But even back a decade ago, when I was just a wee lad, I had noticed that a lot of the new music that they had been showcasing had gotten a bit stale. I didn't know how to describe the music at the time and why it was so mediocre, but since I've had years to reflect now on why the music, which my brother and I have now jokingly started calling Octane-core, is not only so mediocre and formulaic, but why I think that it's a sad reflection on the state of the rock music industry as a whole in this day and age. What prompted me to finally have the idea to write and record this video was that Stained recently released a new song. Love the band or hate the band, I know that they have a lot of haters out there, but I actually really enjoy a lot of their stuff, especially their super early stuff from the Dysfunction album and also some songs from their 2011 self-titled album. I was excited to hear the new song because it had been 12 whole years since their last full-length album was released, or they had really released any new music. I was expecting to hear something, another banger like Not Again from their last album, but when I actually listened to this song, it was just another great example of grade A Octane-core. So what is Octane-core defined by? I would say that it's hard rock music that is engineered specifically to be as catchy and simple as possible. Now, I know that's not necessarily a bad thing. There are a lot of bands out there that do that in a very effective and good way. Like, I would say Rammstein is a good example of that. But this is coming more from bands that just simply don't really have much talent to write songs in the first place, or are just desperately trying to get a new radio hit out of their song. Although there are other things out there that can be described in the same way and not be Octane-core, you essentially just know it when you hear it. The main types of these bands that I see making this kind of music these days are either old bands trying to retain relevance, either if they had maybe one or a few radio hits back in the past and are just trying their hardest to stay relevant with their little shred of relevancy that they ever even had in the first place. Or bands that used to be heavier, mostly metalcore bands that are trying to sound as mainstream and appealing as possible to as many people as possible and just falling flat in the process. And then there are the new bands that are out there trying to gain a following, making this kind of music, either starting out making this kind of music, which is just sad. Then there's the bands that for some reason really want to be Muse. I know this isn't really the same as the rest of the Octane-core kind of subgenre, but there's so many bands out there that are trying to be Muse. I don't know if they realize that even Muse has completely run out of ideas lately. So the average Octane-core song structure is 1. Some kind of short lo-fi intro, either guitar or drums and vocals, or it's just the vocals with some kind of synth pad underneath. 2. An actual cool riff. That's the only cool part of the song. 3. A broken down first verse that's just vocals and a drum pad for some reason. 4. A 4-chord sing-along chorus that's been limited to absolute shit in the mastering process. 5. Another verse that might have guitar in it. 6. Another chorus. 7. A heavy breakdown or bridge that sounds like every other heavy breakdown in every other heavy song. And 8. Another chorus to lead it out. 9. Send the song to Octane and watch your label get all the money while you sit there earning nothing, wondering why the hell you even joined the music industry in the first place. Now, I wouldn't call Octane-core the same thing as butt rock necessarily. I feel like butt rock has a specific sound to it, but I would call it basically the spiritual successor to butt rock in a way, by making up for a lack of real songwriting ability with overproduction. Now, why is this such a problem? I think this is actually tied in very closely with the relative lack of popularity of rock music in the mainstream today compared to essentially the entire existence of rock music since before the 2010s. Even though there was a period of relative unpopularity of rock music in the 1980s, even if it was still somewhat present in the top 40 back in the 80s, it was just relatively low in popularity. Nowadays, it's practically completely non-existent from the top 40. But I'll talk about that more later in the video. How do we fix this problem? There is never going to be a way to completely fix this problem. Since the dawn of the music industry itself, there have always been people who are trying to cash in on the new trends and make music that's fairly soulless in comparison to the actual good music that's out there. So this kind of mediocre music has always been made, but it's never been this egregious in the rock world, in my opinion. What needs to happen is rock bands and rock musicians need to continue to innovate while keeping true to what makes rock music actually work in the first place. So what are what I would consider the strengths of rock music? Two things: raw performance and raw emotion. Most of the time, what's missing is the raw performance aspect of it. Since a lot of the time, these Octane-core songs will actually have a bit of raw emotion in them, talking about things like depression and addiction, which have been staples of topics that have been in rock music since the 1990s, even though they've been topics in blues music since way before that. The problem is the lack of raw performance paired with shoddy songwriting ability. As I had stated before, rock music was relatively unpopular in the 1980s compared to previous decades like the 60s and 70s, but experienced a revival in the 1990s. I see a huge parallel with what's happening today with what happened back then. In the 80s, a ton of rock bands and metal bands wanted to polish up their sound, make their sound more appealing to the masses in order to get more radio play. But then rock music experienced a complete paradigm shift in 1991 with the release of Nirvana's album Nevermind, which caused a chain reaction of other bands with a similar raw rock style to Nirvana to experience mainstream success. This all leads me to feel like I have to mention the new Avenged Sevenfold album, Life is But a Dream. I know this album is quite divisive. A lot of reviewers have been giving it a very hard time, especially Anthony Fantano, but you have to give them props for actually deciding to release and record an album that's so different, not only from everything that they've done before, but from everything else that you hear on the radio nowadays. I saw a lot of people hate on it, and I know it was kind of ambitious in a way that maybe to a lot of people didn't really cut it, that it didn't really sound the way that they had intended it to sound to these people. But I see this album as something that should be very inspiring to a lot of other bands, especially younger bands nowadays, making new music, that they'll see this album actually get success, and a lot of people are talking about it, and they'll realize, hey, maybe we should experiment too with our music. Am I saying that Life is But a Dream is the 2020s version of Nirvana's Nevermind? Absolutely not. That's a completely ridiculous statement to make, but I feel like this album is more of a catalyst than anything else, and it will inspire more bands to eventually start experimenting with their sound, and then after that, maybe then the next Nevermind will eventually come out. Be it in 3 years, in 5 years, in 9 years, or never at all. That's the only way that I really feel like the rock music industry can recover from its lack of popularity. I don't want it to happen once all of these dinosaur legacy rock acts are no longer touring or even no longer alive anymore, so that there's a complete void that has to be filled. I do actually have hope that something like this will happen in the relatively near future. Essentially, I think the rock music industry should stop focusing on trying to compete with pop and rap music and other genres that are way more successful than it, because that's obviously going to be a losing battle. What they have to do is instead try and focus on actually making good music, which is what's going to make people actually want to listen to the music in the first place. I feel like that's self-explanatory, but I still feel like it has to be told to these people. Those are just my opinions and some speculations. Leave your comments below if you feel like I'm completely wrong about this. And make sure to check out my other rant video. And as always,